Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of this Revolution podcast. Let me turn down the chill music that I used to play when we're having our off-air conversations. Makes me want to talk like this, like a radio DJ that comes on late at night, plays slow jams to people that broke up or trying to get with somebody. It's just not really going to work out. All right. And let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
Why are you sounding like you're trying to DJ the Quiet Storm?
Because that's what that shit sounded like to me.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to Jason Miles, who's trying to sound like Wolfman Hack.
There was a Japanese brother we had here in the Bay Area that talked like that. He had a super deep voice, and he did the kind of love line show, whatever you want to call it, Quiet Storm type show, named Theo Misahara. And I remember all the ladies loved his voice. Like, oh, you need to sound like Theo. I remember that guy. I wonder where he is now, but he was a big name here in the Bay Area with that love line stuff.
Theo
Misahara.
Theo Misahara. That's
Japanese brother.
That's a name.
Deep ass voice. Had every chick in the hood going crazy.
Okay. Today
is going to be a good show. Pascal and I have been reading our guest book. It's called we got an advanced copy. Sometimes people hit me up, and most of the time they get to come on the show. And this gentleman was like, hey man, I've seen your show. I got a book coming out on Zero. And my first instinct was like, God damn it, Doug Lane, why didn't you let me know this shit? That was like my first instinct. Whatever. Dan sent me the PDF, and it took forever for us to get to it because a lot of people that come on this show, as you guys know, write books that Pascal and I actually do read. Not just the introduction and the end. We actually read the middle part too. And I was blown away by Dan's book because it's not just a book about immigration, but it definitely, you said it better, Pascal, earlier today. How would you describe Dan's book?
It's a book that roots American immigration in capitalism and political economy, and gives you the nuances of how that's always been the motivation behind immigration law.
Yes. And in making the intro video for this show, I came across some footage that another reason why I'm so excited to talk about this show. A lot of times we talk about immigration law, especially over the last, what would you say, 3-4 years, right? Because the kids in cages gets really blown up during the Trump administration, and it pulls on heartstrings. But we don't really talk about the capitalism problem, and we definitely don't talk about something we talked about a few weeks ago, imperialist realism, right? We don't talk about empire. We just talk about how sad it is. So I actually put some of that. I'm saying this as a warning. I am a dad. I had to listen to this like 25 times to get the edits and cuts right, and I cried every time. So it's a rough watch, but I think it's an important watch, not just from the emotional aspect of seeing families torn away, but hopefully that opens a door so we can get into a deeper conversation about immigration. So before we bring in our guest, let us play this clip.
Tens of thousands of these workers are brought across the border from Mexico every year. They are given a quickie physical examination at El Centro, then sent to work on big farms in the Imperial Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, the Salinas Valley, the Santa Clara Valley. They work mostly for big farmers who call themselves growers, although they personally grow and harvest only profits. Before World War II, most of the workers in California's fields were domestic agricultural laborers, following the crops every year. During the war, a farm labor shortage developed. Mexican workers were brought in to meet the emergency. Then the war ended. The emergency was over, but the employers knew a good thing when they saw one. They decided to keep on importing braceros from Mexico under agreements between the U.S. and Mexican governments. Now they prefer Mexican nationals to domestic labor, not because of some sentimental attachment for Mexican food or Mexican culture or Mexican music, nor because of any real shortage of domestic American labor. It is because a big supply of imported Mexican labor forces down the real wages of American farm workers. It is because an endless supply of destitute contract labor means more profits for the owners of California's rich soil and guarantees them against organization of these workers into unions.
Ever since the United States ceased to be a colony of the British Empire, immigration has been used as a tool of the ruling class to regulate labor. While xenophobic fears may ignite passionate debate, capitalism is the driving factor in the bipartisan draconian immigration legislation we see to this day. We'll discuss capitalism's role in the United States southern border policy and more. This is Revolution.
I'm very pleased that you could all be here today. I know how busy you've been with events leading up to Tuesday's election, and I want to congratulate all of you in the House of Representatives who've just been re-elected. This bill, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that I'll sign in a few minutes, is the most comprehensive reform of our immigration laws since 1952. It's the product of one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings in the last 3 Congresses. Further, it's an excellent example of a truly successful bipartisan effort.
¿De dónde son ustedes? ¿Y tú?
Guatemala.
No llores. Vas a llegar con... Mira, ella te va a explicar y te va a ayudar. ¿Cierto, Consul?
¿Qué va a pasar con su consulado hoy? Papá.
And that family is a stock shot that I found, and it wasn't in horror. That was like the scariest thing I've ever seen, was that family waving those flags. But let's bring in our guest. He is a immigration lawyer, now author. And he'll tell us the date. I don't know exactly when the book is coming out, but the book is called Borderlines, coming out on Zero Books. Mr. Dan Melo, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, so good to be on.
Thank you for coming through, Dan.
Yeah, no.
Dan Melo, my man. Dan.
So I want to read something from your book, because part of that clip was Reagan signing the 1986 Immigration Reform Act. And, oh God, damn it. And of course the page moved on me. Here it goes. Even Reagan's 1986 infamous amnesty was first sold as a crackdown. It opened the door of status to nearly 3 million people, but left out 2 million more and increased immigration enforcement spending to secure the border. Measures that improve the circumstances for some migrants have rarely been pursued on exclusively universalist principles of humanitarian treatment and are often packaged with increased enforcement. Legal immigration creates narrow channels that can be easily turned off, while ensuring that enforcement and other targeted measures prevent migrants from readily organizing or establishing any other foothold within the system. It's just a short paragraph from the Reagan bill. So what was Reagan's motivation for signing that bill that gave 3 million migrant citizenship with a swipe of the pen?
Yeah, I mean, in Reagan's time, you know, it's like we had there's a whole lot of backstory to it, but the gist is just that it's like at that particular political moment, there was sort of this sentiment in the country is like, well, we need to do something about the growing number of undocumented people in the country, and this was sort of the ticket into if you want to call it a bipartisanship thing, like what is ultimately just what worked out best for the ruling class, for capital broadly speaking, was that, hey, we can appease, a big block of folks by saying, hey, we're going to let these people come in. Now, the amnesty part has always been perplexing to me, because it's like these folks up to this day, like some folks are actually still able to fit through that particular process, still required a whole bunch of applications. You still had to basically raise your hand, to the government, say, hey, I'm here, I want to fix my status, pay, fines. There's a big monetary cost involved for a lot of migrants, and sure, a lot of people ultimately were able to get on better footing, from a migration perspective. But like I mentioned in that paragraph, it left a whole hell of a lot of people outside of that, right? And once again, in that particular moment, it was just, hey, we can make it look like we're doing the humanitarian thing here and get the benefit of throwing a whole lot of money at border enforcement. And, that has just been shot up ever since then, has just continued to climb year in and year out, in terms of border spending, all things related to migration controls, Department of Homeland Security, which we can talk about later. But that was one of those pivotal moments where it's like we saw the use of the migrant situation in the country to prop up more basically militarization against migrants. And so it's like, sorry to go on a longer tangent here.
No,
but
go for it.
This
form show.
This idea, right, that it was amnesty in any real sense, right? That it's like we were forgiving these people, forgiving them for what, right? Like for just being here, raising families, paying into systems that they would never be able to draw. Like amnesty for what, right? And ultimately, it sort of flies in the face of any kind of like true humanitarian idea if you have to couple that with militarized border enforcement.
Interesting. Dan, in reading your book, I got to tell you, there were a lot of things that I found fascinating. One is that you basically do a comprehensive history of American immigration law policy. And as Jason told you in the green room, one of the actual things that you said in your first chapter was that you talked about how the decision of the U.S. Congress in 1803 to quote unquote stop the immigration of Negroes, mulattoes, or I think there was another category as well, was directly as a consequence of the Haitian Revolution, because they did not want Haitians who had just defeated 3 European empires coming into North America to basically stir up rebellion amongst the domestic black population. I had known that the Haitian Revolution was a significant reason why the transatlantic slave trade overall stopped, and particularly to the United States. But it was interesting for you to cite that particularly. So I got interested in your book very quickly because I realized that your ability to notice that and include that was fascinating. One of the things you do in your book is that you basically say that throughout America's history, historically and contemporarily, the immigrants that come to this country, whether overseas or across borders, have always been viewed as commodities. Basically, that they are commodities, and that the ultimate fate of those immigrants always rests in their utility to capital and to labor. The first question I want to ask you, just to get a general frame, do you believe that, number one, do you believe in nation-state theory? And do you believe that there's any validity in a nation-state having the right to control its borders? Because if we start from there, I mean, maybe we can determine how we should approach this conversation.
Yeah, I guess to put it in really stark terms, the answer is no, right? I understand how we got here. I understand, and I talk about in the book, sort of how the modern nation state grows out of capitalism, because I do think that, that is an essential part of the understanding of like the division between people, right? Well, one of the examples I use in the book in describing like how we understand the citizen and the not, right? And even within immigration law, specifically within the statute, it defines a non-citizen, an alien, as anyone who isn't a citizen. And conversely, citizens are only folks who are born or naturalized in the United States, right? And so if we look at this idea of the nation state, right, it's like the further you peel back those layers, you suddenly realize that it's like this division between the us, them part of that has always worked in favor of capital, right? And this idea of sovereign power over human beings, who, where the lines get drawn between who's on the inside, who's on the outside, who's the immigrant, who's not, those aren't collectively democratically decided, right? Instead, they are founded on the needs of capital. So I guess to answer the question just very, very bluntly, right, the answer is no. Again, I understand that there's, talking about imperialism, imperialist realism a couple of weeks ago, I understand from a practical perspective where we would launch a politics against that idea. But, at the very end of the book, I just bring that all around to like that this division, specifically how the nation state is set up to divide and requires division between peoples, right, is ultimately unjustifiable.
That's, I should, as I'm sure because from a left perspective, that opens up a whole can of worms of conversation, of debate, of discourse. Because as I'm sure that there are various ideologies that we have or worldviews on the left that would disagree with that. For example, Bernie Sanders himself says, "No, I don't support open borders. That's a Koch brothers policy."
Yeah.
Well, no politician is going to come out and say they support open borders because there's too many. Let's just be honest, right? This book pretty much starts in 1790 when we talk about immigration. So we're talking about since the inception of this being a sovereign nation, immigration and open borders has been a very bad word. And, you have to keep the Monroe Doctrine in mind as well. So I can't see any left politician, progressive, insert adjective here of how you want to describe them, say they're for any sort of open borders or even wanting to get into an immigration conversation, because it's such a minefield for far right. Because how long, Pascal, would you say, we talk about the 50, let's start saying 50 plus year counter revolution, right? Because if you say it starts at the year of your birth, 1968, now we're talking 50 plus year counter revolution. Part of that counter revolution isn't just saying a new way to say nigger, nigger, nigger. Another part of that counter revolution is weaponizing the border, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Dan does a very good job of talking about how the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Cuban Rehabilitation Act, all within the context of American Cold War politics, were a very, very important part of how the 50-year counter-revolution and the subsequent immigration politics that comes to be is debated, as a matter of fact. So, again, I'm not trying to be a stickler. I'll be very honest with you. I'm fluid on the nation-state ideology. I think there are a lot of legitimate reasons. I have some friends who are anarchists, quite frankly, and people laugh at political anarchists. There are very good arguments to demonstrate that the nation-state project is always a bourgeois project, empowering the bourgeoisie of whatever nation-state, forcing usually working-class people to buy into a fictitious notion of patriotism that is almost always an illusion, regardless of the nation-state, to be regulated and used as fodder for military, and labor to be having their labor oppressed and extracted from the bourgeoisie to their detriment. So there are lots of legitimate, from a quote-unquote anti-capitalist or Marxist framework or anarchist framework, to debate the legitimacy of the nation state. However, my position is that in this current political moment, there are those who consider themselves good leftists, democratic socialists, who are arguing that we need to protect the borders, because how else is a nation state going to dictate the distribution of goods and services and labor and work and state policy of public goods governance if the borders of a nation state and its sovereignty are not recognized? And Dan, I want to ask you, how do you respond to that position, and how do you try to, as someone who's on the left, I'm pretty sure based on your book that you're on zero.
It's a fair assumption. I mean, I will, just to back up just a little bit, right? Something else that I talk about or try to talk about briefly in the book is like, I'll admit, you know, capitalist realism here, it's very, very hard to imagine a world right now where nation states don't exist, right? And it's so much so that it's like this has infiltrated almost all aspects of our, you know, just general society, political culture, right? Obviously, there are plenty of places in the world that still don't quite, where groups of people don't necessarily identify with their nation state, right? But, you know, like, to use examples, like I am half Dominican, half, you know, U.S. Born American. And so when people talk about me versus when they talk about my father, who's from the Dominican Republic, right? Like there's just this inherent, like, outsider, insider, assimilated, not assimilated, all that to say, right, that it's like, it's that sort of that famous phrase, just slightly reworked, of like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It's like, well, same thing here, right? It's actually tentatively the end of the world if all nation states are suddenly disappear, right, and are eradicated. And so at the end of the day, right, like I acknowledge right up front that there's going to be big problems, right, trying to overcome the divides that are set up by capitalism between people. I think somebody actually pointed this out in the chat, though, that it's like capital has had no problem moving across borders, right? And frankly, just doesn't give a shit, like, which, you know, amalgamation of nations in the particular moment exists, as long as the machinery is still running, right? And so in that way, it almost, to me, offers a little bit of a window into that possibility that it's like, if capital has successfully made this transition across borders, across nation states, then we could theoretically get there. I am not smart enough to come up with a plan to do that. But one example, you know, it's on a much smaller scale, again, acknowledge openly that this is true. But, you know, when people talk about, and I think like everyone from Bernie Sanders to Angela Nagel, you know, talking sort of about this idea that it's like, we just can't have open borders, right, because of all the problems that come up. Of course, there are going to be problems. Like the end of slavery had, a whole host of political, economic problems that were going to be associated with it. That is a pretty poor justification to continue a practice of division, right? Or in this case, to me, a practice of dehumanizing people for the sake of capital, right? And so if we're going to even begin to have a conversation about how we transcend capital and nation states, which I think are, to some degree, like those two are going to have to go together if we're going to get past this at all. We're going to have to first start challenging the fundamental notions about what it means to be inside and outside of a political community. And just quickly to sort of wrap that thought up, it's like Hannah Arendt, you know, in talking about the nature of a refugee, right? It's like, it's precisely at the moment where rights are most necessary for the refugee that they are the least available. And that is the status now, unfortunately, of just millions of people. That number keeps growing every year, right? That it's like the protections that are supposed to exist for the people are the least available for the most vulnerable. And so we've got to start challenging this idea.
Now, I want to before you elaborate, Pascal, I do want to get back to what we're talking about when it comes to empire, capitalism, and immigration. And one thing I definitely want to talk about is it's a constant sticking point, especially here in California. I don't know so much about North Carolina where you are, Dan, and Pascal. I don't think this affects you as much, but definitely South Texas deals with this, and that's MS-13. MS-13 is the big bad boogeyman of why you don't have open borders. And I'm going to read this passage from your book and ask you to expand even more on this, because I do want to kind of get into the weeds a little bit on this. You say the brutal Mara Salvatra gang, commonly known as the MS-13, originated in Los Angeles during the 70s and 80s, a gang that developed from an increasing population of young, stateless migrants fleeing El Salvador's U.S.-fueled conflict. The U.S. then transplanted the gang to Central America in large numbers through the deportation process. In 2010 alone, the U.S. deported 120,000 gang members, most to the Northern Triangle. U.S. imperialism kickstarted and perpetuated an increasingly violent cycle of poverty, displacement, and a blurred line between criminal empires and corrupt state officials. The existence of these capitalist-created nightmares, in turn, help keep the propaganda wheel turning by perpetuating the view of migrants and the violence they face in terms of U.S. national security rather than a product of failed economic and military policy, thus reducing U.S. culpability and cementing the perception of migrants as threats. Now, of course, a lot of El Salvadorian refugees start coming up through the early to mid 80s because of these CIA-backed death squads. Yeah. And then what happens? Dan.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought that was a rhetorical. Well, then what happens? Oh, so right. So we start seeing large displacements from those areas. A lot of young men, mostly, displaced from those areas, start to make their way to the West Coast. Start finding that settling into impoverished areas. Who, to make a long story short, start seeing the rise of more and more gang activity, find a place to belong, and come together. And so we slowly, see that gang grow in size and in power. And rather than, once again, targeting, this is a cliche line, but rather than like targeting the conditions, right, that started to create and foster that stuff, the U.S. is like, we're just going to send you home. So, as noted, tens of thousands at this point, gang members who, again, were here in the first place because of U.S. imperialism in Central and South America. We start seeing those folks taken back with all of the knowledge that they have now and all of that stuff, go back to Central America then and start building up power there, criminal enterprises there, to the point where, of course, now it's just an absolutely massive organization that, frankly, it's as best as I can tell, right, the U.S. Central America has no answer for at the moment. We don't know what to do with it other than to, once again, have it not be here. So as long as it's not here, whatever, right? And I wrote an article recently for Hampton Institute, talking a little bit about, thank you, talking a little bit about Kamala Harris's recent trip to Central America, right, and talking about the tackling the root causes of migration, right? That was one of Biden's big things, was we're going to tackle the root causes of migration. It's like I swear that there's no way that this administration is even aware at this point of like, and this isn't, we're not even talking about a massive time scale, right? Like all of this has happened in the last, 50, 60 years, but no concept of like how we got here in the first place. And instead has already been able to turn the focus away from like how the US has basically built these gangs from scratch, and instead talk about, okay, well, it's all because, you guys are corrupt and have allowed this criminal enterprise to flourish. And that's why we're seeing all of these families, fleeing from the area to come up here.
Dan, I'm gonna get controversial with you here. I'm gonna get controversial with you here because with the rise of Trump, that reactionary, nationalist, anti-immigrant posture is not simply a posture that redneck Trump supporters were touting. Yeah. There have been movements of black folk, well, I'm not going to name names, but we know what they are, who have embraced the anti-immigrant sentiment under the argument that immigration persistently disadvantages Black Americans because it undercuts their ability for competitive labor pricing for work and finding good low-wage jobs, which particularly is the traditional realm where working class, particularly Black men, look for work. Also, it fosters an international class of people who buy into racist narratives of Black lives and always has Black people being pit against them as the quote-unquote failed community, because look at all these immigrants that come here and succeed. And that generally, overall, the process and practice of immigration is a zero-sum loss for Black America. From your own book, and I found this very fascinating because I didn't know this. I made an analogy between two periods of time. In 1863, African Americans are getting emancipated because of the Civil War and Lincoln's amendment changes to the Constitution. What I learned in your book is that right after that, in 1864, Lincoln signed a massive pro-immigration bill to flood the United States with cheap labor because they felt that there would be a shortage of work because slaves were being freed. Here's the metaphor. 1965, we have the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and all these bills that are signed to basically, metaphorically, liberate Black America from Jim Crow so they can compete in the labor market. What is signed in 1965? A massive immigration reform bill that allows immigrants from all over the world, including my parents, to come to the United States and basically create positions where they are competitive labor with African Americans. What about that history makes it illegitimate for Black Americans to say that immigration is used as a tool to displace Black labor and force it even further down into the reserve army of labor? I'm not saying I believe that argument. What I'm saying,
I would even add this, and I want to see what Dan has to say about this. So if we go back and look at the original housekeepers, domestic work, right? Mm-hmm. And you think about residential schools, that's what they were training people for, domestic work, right? So the original domestics, if you go back and watch an old film, as you see these videos, I watch a lot of old films, all those people were Black. Hotel workers, the maids, they were all Black. And as Pascal is saying, right around the civil rights time, you start getting this influx of new labor coming from south of the border. The same can be said, people say about construction, in the trades, and also in things like meat packing. So recently there was a raid, was it last year? There was a big raid in a bunch of meat packing plants, actually in the South, not too far from you, Dan and Pascal. And a big reason why they knew to raid those places is because that's who came to take those jobs And the wages they were making, and actually there were some studies that came to show the wages they were making were less than what cats were making 30 years ago when it was dominated by union labor. So the original clip that opens that video is a union clip about why the Bracero program was a problem. And I believe Cesar Chavez wasn't a big fan initially because they say it in the clip. I didn't want to get the whole thing because it's just too much. And it was kind of felt a little like, I don't think you like brown people too much. But but that was the big problem. These cats could not unionize. And it's kind of a constant theme within your book as well when you talk about kind of the enslavement of these cats. I have a workforce, a dedicated workforce that can't organize and ask me for shit. As the Me Too movement is blowing up all over Hollywood, there was also a movement of migrant farm workers, mostly women, that were talking about the sexual assaults they were suffering literally on the job. I want to add that on to what Pascal said.
I want to add another thing. One of the great socialist heroes of the black left, and even particularly the Jacobin DSA crowd, loves A. Philip Randolph, great socialist. A. Philip Randolph was profoundly anti-immigration, particularly because of the way he felt it was going to affect black labor. That's a fact.
Yeah.
And now, I'm interested in your response. I have my own, but I would like to hear, how do you deal with that with that charge?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more or less, like Nagel in that whole argument against open borders sort of made a very similar argument, right? That it's like this ends up hurting the working class. And I point that out a couple places in the book, right? That like even right-wing, like the FAIR think tanks, right, have pointed this out, that it's like immigrant labor hurts American workers, right? And, to use an analogy, right, the almost an identical argument was made when women started to enter the workforce. Mm-hmm. So many labor unions were against this because like they're going to undercut our wages. It's going to reduce overall conditions, positive conditions for us as a workforce. It's going to be tough to get them to join, on and on and on. It's like, so women should not be allowed to join the workforce. And again, to be really cliche about this, but I really think it's true, right? That it's like the response must always be, it's like to pause for a minute and say, wait a minute, who does this benefit, right? That we are thrown against each other? Because to be honest, like it's not that it's incorrect, right? Like, yes, migrant workers, due to their status, due to the way that they're treated, ultimately are going to undercut wages in a lot of sectors because they are cheaper. And so, of course, any sector where, we're talking about them displacing black workers, it would make sense for there to be tensions there then. But that conflict, that doesn't benefit black people, that doesn't benefit women in the other analogy that I use, and it certainly doesn't benefit migrants. No, it benefits capital, right? Because the capitalist ruling class, who gives a shit who's filling those jobs as long as they're doing it cheaply, right? Like, who gives a shit? Like, it doesn't matter what color skin they are or anything else. Honestly, anything else.
I would add this. It also, with NAFTA, what you get when you destroy agricultural sectors is people that might have owned farms or been higher up the food chain on a farm, coming down to take a peon job in the States. There's always that joke in movies where it's like, I was a doctor in my other country and now I drive a cab here, right? Or maybe you had an Uber driver that might have been somebody a lot more in their other country, and they come here and they have this, this really shit job. And you get into that, and this is what I'm trying to pivot to, when you talk about H1b visas, which is a conversation I don't hear too much on the left because it almost feels like for most people a bit of a PMC conversation. But it's an important conversation because I think it also leads to what we're talking about here, because you're talking about a captive workforce that can't do shit. They don't have any rights. So as we talk about, like, how do you organize in the tech space? It's damn near impossible when you have large swaths of the tech space here on H1b visas that are terminated the moment their job is terminated. So you're only here on a contract, hoping to get said contract renewed, making a lot more than you're making at your home country. I don't have to give you benefits. I can just give you a good chunk of change, and you just shut the fuck up.
Well, I have a pretty easy rebuttal to Black Americans who say that there are no benefits that immigration presents to Black Americans. I said that's absolutely false. And you will say, why? I said, why? I said, because the immigrants that come to the United States that also make up the reserve army of labor serves as a buffer for those Black people who would fill up that gap if those immigrants were not there. Simple fact. Look at this. In terms of numbers, Black people make up 13% of the population and make 40% of the U.S. Incarcerated. White people make up 64% of the population and make up 39% of the U.S. 39% of U.S. incarcerated. Hispanic people make up 16% of the population and make up 19% of the incarcerated. If the Hispanics were not there, who do you think would fill up that 19% of incarcerated? White people or Black people?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It ain't gonna be white people.
Yeah, very fair. No, that's an excellent point, actually. And frankly, one that I just hadn't even considered. That, yeah, it's like those bodies are going to end up in those spots, and they're going to come from somewhere. So, yeah. And to circle back just briefly, I don't know if everyone is familiar with H1Bs, but it's basically, yeah, where you bring skilled laborers over from abroad, and there's supposed to be all these protections in place, right? Where they are supposed to pay the same wages, the prevailing wage is the standard, right? Where it actually has to go through the Department of Labor. There's this whole process, right, that's supposed to guarantee that capitalists aren't, basically abusing migrants and also throwing, people present already in the country out of jobs. But what ends up happening, right, and this is pretty well documented at this point, is that many of the tech giants have a great deal of control over what the prevailing wage is. So they're just easy to set those very, very low. And of course, because that money is still better than what a lot of people are making in their home countries, you end up bringing those people here. But as you pointed out, Jason, there's absolutely no obligation to sponsor them for any kind of permanent status. So literally, you try to unionize. It's like, you're out, your contract's done, I'm done with you, bye, deported. You try to raise complaints about working conditions, same shit, right? So again, whether you're talking about in the fields or behind a computer desk, it really doesn't matter. Migrants are completely locked out of most kinds of, the already frail kinds of political access that workers, have presently. So yeah, it's like, once again, I think to try to justify things in terms of, well, this group of people is causing harm to another just by being present. It's like, wait a minute, let's take a step even further back and say, who is this benefiting, right? Who would even conceivably benefit from pitting these two groups against each other?
And Gene Bajlan, he's a part of the show, it was also had an H1b visa, and he brought up the point that another part of the show, part of the foreign policy crew, Kuba Rizhnevsky. See, Kuba, when you're not here, I'm going to say your name as much as possible. Kuba got sent home. That's why Kuba does the show from a different country, because he literally
I did not know that. Okay.
In his H1B when he lost his job. So someone was a little confused in the chat and thought we were saying that I was a little confused on your devil's advocate argument, Pascal. So if you want to elaborate what we're trying to get across.
What I'm trying to say is that if you're arguing as a Black American that immigration is undercutting you, you're failing to realizing that the reserve army of labor, or the bottom of the labor pool, is not only reserved for Black people, it's also reserved for a lot of those immigrants. And if those immigrants aren't here, there's going to be a need to fill up that gap of the reserve army of labor, which means prison, crime, drugs, depopulation, all of that harmful stuff. That gap is not going to be filled with white people. It's going to be filled with black people. So what I'm saying is that literally the presence of those immigrants create a buffer to decrease the number of black people that are forced into the reserve army of labor. So literally you can make an argument that the presence of those immigrants, particularly Hispanics, protects large numbers of blacks from even more being foisted even more into the armpit of the reserve army of labor.
And to kind of go deeper down that rabbit hole, we are not fans of the ADOS movement on this show. I said it. There you go. We're not going to have a debate about it. We've all mentioned why we're not big fans of it. And if you don't know, go watch an old episode.
Well, let's talk about solutions to that problem.
But that's what I want to actually use a real example, and that's the Japanese. The Japanese who get interned in, is it 42?
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, I think 42.
Right after Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor, I think it's 41. Yeah. So right after Pearl Harbor, there's a large internment of Japanese. But I think most people think it's all Japanese people. No. It was the majority of Japanese people that lived on the West Coast.
Yep.
And not the Japanese people that lived in Hawaii. Because
places, right?
Why, Dan?
Well, because they were so essential to the economic health of the islands that, again, you would think of all places post Pearl Harbor, right? That the internment would start in the islands. No, I want to say that in far fewer numbers in Hawaii were Japanese interned, because it's like without them, literally the economy there grinds to a halt, right? And so once again, there's those examples peppered throughout of just how essential this labor question, the political economy question is to deciding who gets to be here, who doesn't, or in that case, who gets to go behind chain link fence and who doesn't.
Which is insane. When you think about that, because it didn't involve a lot of Japanese people that lived on the East Coast. And again, I haven't finished the book. I don't know if you talk about it in your book. Do you talk about the relationship between West Coast Japanese people and agriculture?
No, I don't touch on that specific thing, and frankly, I'm not as familiar as I should be.
I would have been like, one thing I'll say about Dan's book, it's a good, quick read. Short, concise chapters, and expanding on Japanese and agriculture could be like a whole other thing. But there's actually quite a few articles out now about it. But another big reason, a big push for the internment of Japanese was the fact that they controlled a good segment of the agriculture in California. And that's why you have so many from the West Coast that end up getting interned.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about a remedy to the problem we're talking about in terms of working class people feel that immigrants displace their labor. What you do when you're worried about competing labor, cutting your ability to leverage your work for pay, is to demand increased quality worker protections for everyone who can work in America, regardless of how they got here. Talk about increasing the speed in which immigrants get naturalized, become residents, or become citizens, which would automatically require that they cannot be paid under certain levels of pay for jobs. Mm-hmm. Increase unionization for people with green cards so that they can actually work with black people in unions to actually demand that their labor do not get undercut. Have black people join immigration advocacy organizations to say, okay, we're going to have immigration no matter what, but let's set this up in a way so that our labor is not undercut, and that your ability to work and get a fair wage is actually protected as well, and that we do not damage the integrity of the workforce in the United States. If you're worried about people denying you a job because you can't speak English and you live in Miami, make a legal requirement. You cannot deny anyone in the United States from labor participation because of their inability to speak a foreign language. Period.
Yeah,
And-
I just think that every single time the answer should always be, hang on a second, we're, to be really Marxist about this, like, we're on the same side here. The infighting is only ever going to benefit those up top.
There's a comment here in the chat. And how do we fight for better wages when wage work seems to be disappearing? One of the main themes that we have in this show is movements, right? We always talk about there needs to be a movement. And whenever we look back in movements, they were always rooted in labor. And people died to unionize, right? Cross racial lines in places like West Virginia, died to unionize. There's a reason why you see a rise of gig work. There's a reason why Proposition 22 got, was it $100 some million or $18 million dumped into a proposition like that, considering the fact that the initial bill that it was fighting had a non-unionizing caveat in it. AB 5 said you can't unionize, and still it was too much for the tech workers. So the gigification of the economy should be something that people mobilize and fight against. But a big problem is it's hard to get movements rooted in labor when we're seeing the neoliberalization of work, right? Everybody's their own boss. More charter schools.
Yeah,
So-
it moves the responsibility, right, for your situation onto you, right? And that's just, capitalism ideology at its very best, right? Is that, like, the migrants are in their place because it's their fault, right? Black people are in their place because it's their fault. Gig workers are there because it's their fault, right? Like, opportunities there, wherever you are in life, that's where you landed, that's on you. And so again, I just think that the response always is going to have to start with, hey, hang on a second, rather than pausing to wonder why this person's coming in to move me out. We should say, wait a minute, maybe we can band together against what's happening.
The more you know. How you feeling, Pascal?
This is a great conversation, man. I'm glad we're having it.
I told you. I've been yelling at Pascal.
We hit the hard questions.
I've been yelling at Pascal all week because I can tell when Pascal hasn't read the book yet, and I was yelling at him. You don't understand. I'm making this public because I want people to understand A, the respect and love I have for my co-host, and B, the brotherly relationship that we have. I know, I haven't known him forever, but I know when he hasn't read the book yet, and I know when he has read the book. And I look on social media, and he has taken a section out of Dan's book and tweeted it out. And he put it on Facebook. I was like, he finally read it. I told him he would like it as soon as he read it. See? He's just over. There's a lot of books we have to read.
I believe that, yeah.
A lot.
But I love the zero ones because we know the strategy behind zero books.
Keep it short and simple.
Short.
Keep it short and simple.
I was part of I just to give a window to the background. Like, I pitched a 50,000 word book, and they're like, well, you can do 35. Fair enough.
Yeah. When I first I get the request, it's like, I have a book coming out on zero. I was like, yeah, send it over. I know we can.
Al says, man, they're always busting Pascal's balls. They're always trying. They ain't going to bust them. They try. They try all the time.
Well, when he's the superstar of the internet, you know.
Low-key viral, I think someone said on a previous show.
Oh, dude, you can't go anywhere without someone being like, man, that Pascal Robert. How do I get a hold of that guy? Because he doesn't get the emails I do. So I got to get it. Man, I saw Pascal Robert on such and such show, and I need to have him on my show. I am the quality control. Thank you for adding to the Juice Box Fund, because Pascal and I do not drink. We are non-drinkers.
Don't do the booze.
I don't drink, but I'm still a good time.
I like tea, though. If you're into like special teas, we can do tea.
What does Janice Graham say? She said you need to ensure publishers are sending independence review copies. We just get
the PDF.
Yeah, Doug just sends us the PDF. There was one book, I won't say which one, that's a 500 some page book. It was this gentleman. I'm not going to talk who it was. It was a gentleman's life work, and we did get a review copy from another friend's show. But I do save everything the publisher ever sends me, because I get all giddy when it comes in the mail. I don't know about Pascal. You get giddy when it comes in the mail?
I just got a couple of books in the mail recently.
Nice.
From the.
I've also started buying books on Kindle because it's cheaper.
I have to do that now because it's quicker.
That's true. That as well.
So yeah, I mentioned there's going to be some interesting things coming up. I will be leaving for vacation the last 2 weeks of the month. People were saying, "What are you still doing here? I thought you were going on vacation." Thanks. I guess maybe I should leave sooner. You people, hey, what a crowd! Someone's asking if you smoke or vape.
Not in the age of COVID. I don't want to do anything that could affect lungs adversely, but I'm not going to say that I have not partaken in the sticky green. Me loves the edibles.
And now the video's demonetized.
Shut it down, folks.
Wherever you're listening or watching the show, there are links in the description to Dan's book. There's definitely links in the chats to Dan's book. We are coming up on an hour. That means we're about to head into the if Dan is down, patron only after hours segment. But yeah, so Thursday we have Brianna Joy Gray coming on because Pascal is her new co-host.
Oh, easy.
That's true.
Brianna Joy Gray is coming. I was coming on Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be further talking about the crisis of Black politics and opening the Overton window of Black politics to the left. It's going to be a good conversation. We're going to go deep into the weeds in Black political history, Black political thought. We're going to take Sister Brianna Joy Gray there. Whether she's ready or not, we're going to go deep into the cervical cortex of Black political thought.
And the video for that one required me to watch so much Black nationalism that it
made him want to put on an FOI hat.
Yes. I slapped 4 white people today.
By the way, when you guys see the intro
Wow.
video that Jason did for our show on Thursday, it was a masterpiece. Jason outdid himself.
Thank you. I was very, very proud of that. It took quite a few hours. As I was recording the music for that, the last note broke a string, so I'm kind of pissed off. But
Don't forget the merch we have on the website.
Oh, can I share it before we go? Dan, do you mind? Before we go, we're going to share this. Hold on, Pascal, be entertaining while I find it. You're not being entertaining.
You want me to be entertaining?
Yeah, tell a joke, something.
What do you want me to do, the human beatbox?
No, now I want you to not be entertaining. I want you to take entertainment and stop it. I want you to stop all entertainment.
What does it say? Be entertaining. What do I look like? Jim, like James Brown?
No.
I was it.
No.
Man's world.
No.
This is
You don't look
man's world.
no James I know. Brown, Clyburn, you don't look like none of them Negroes. So
Nothing without a woman or a girl. Man in the car.
you sound like you need to go to somebody's jute joint somewhere. So for those that don't know, we have merchandise for the show. I know it's a little hot. We have sweatshirts. We have t-shirts. In the great words of Rusty Cundiff in Fear of a Black Hat, we got hats, motherfucker. Jean Bajlan just got a hat. I ordered one of the t-shirts. I ordered this t-shirt here for my girl. Jean got this Revolution hat. You can just go to thisisrevolutionpodcast.com. Pascal was FOI like right before he joined the show.
No, it was not. I was never been FOI. When we hit 1,000 patrons, let you know we are planning in some location in the state of California to have a live show.
We are.
God will.
COVID permitting. COVID permitting.
COVID permitting.
I will tell a quick COVID story why I'm scared to do anything. People sometimes ask, when are you going on tour? When are you going on tour? When are you going on tour? When are you on tour? So a band much bigger than mine recently got ready to do a 3-week tour. And they were all vaccinated. They had like a 16-member crew. And like 4 guys in the band. I know one of the guys in the band real well. Everybody got COVID. Everybody got COVID. They had to get quarantined somewhere in the country that was far from home. I don't even know if the singer's even been home because he's got a family with little kids and he doesn't want to go home because he knows his kids can't get the vaccine. So I'm terrified to go tour. I know how nasty places were beforehand. It's not like some of those places got clean. Fuck that noise. So COVID permitting, 1,000 patrons, live show somewhere in California. Not going to tell you guys where just yet.
Welcome to the Hotel California.
Didn't see that one coming.
Such a lovely place.
Didn't see the pivot from James Brown to the Eagles.
Eagles, classic rock. You know I'm a classic rock fan.
I do. You are, because Pascal got mad at me because I said Foreigner was yacht rock.
Foreigner is the shiznit, man.
Foreigner is yacht rock.
Get on with the yacht rock, man.
You know what? This outro is yacht rock. Peace.